All right, good morning, everyone. We have a great fortune to have someone that is a master of playing in multiple styles. As many of you are aware, in the band field, in the Army and the military band field, we can't afford to be just great jazzers or great legit players. We have to be jacks of all trade and be able to do everything. He's here to help us understand how to do that better. So, I got a little bit of your bio. I won't read the whole thing. So this is Scott Litrofff. How many of you already know him? I've already met him. All right. Okay, so this is for everyone else. He's already performed at Lincoln Center, Yoshi's Clubs in San Francisco, the Jazz Alley in Seattle. He's performed with one of my favorite musicians, Ray Anderson. He was also a student of Ray Anderson. Does anyone, okay, other than a trombone player in this room, does anyone else know who Ray Anderson is? But also Steve Salerno and Nilly McCabe he's performed with. He's currently teaching. He's the assistant professor of music at Queensborough Community College. And he loves to collaborate with other composers and has actually commissioned works, which is really important because otherwise the literature just dies after a while if no one's commissioning new stuff and working with them. He's also recorded with Oatmeal Jazz Combo along with other things, I suppose. He's won awards, the 2013 Samuel Barron Prize and the 2012 Ackerman Prize in Music. He's got a doctorate and a bachelor's from Stony Brook and a master's from the Man's College of Music. Without further ado, I give you Scott Litrofff.
Welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me. So I'd like to start with short performance. In virtually all the clinics I've given, I've come in with a plan. And usually that plan ends up breaking down when so many people ask me questions that are specifically related to style diversity. And so I just stopped fighting it. And I feel like this is a topic that, especially in the classical saxophone community, but across many genres, people may have their inclination toward a particular style of music. You may be trained formally or informally in any style, but desire greater versatility. And I would imagine that especially in your field, that there's such a diverse type of repertoire that you will access professionally, and it's good to have an open mind, not just about the repertoire that you're going to perform, but means of learning the repertoire, means of becoming more effective as a player in those repertoire. So I have two selections. One is a classical selection, and the other is jazz. And I'm going to start with, this is the opening to the Pierre Dubois saxophone concerto. It's one of the only saxophone concerti that begins with a cadenza, so it was perfect because there's no accompaniment anyway. So I hope you enjoy it. Ends on a 1. So. One time I performed that as just the cadenza, and I didn't bother to play the E flat, and I think a few people were a bit angry. I never resolved the chord, so I always remember just play the E flat at the end. So my background is, I consider it to be an interesting one musically. My first instrument was violin. I was 7 years old, and for the better part of 15 years, violin was my main instrument, but I was learning saxophone and flute and clarinet in tandem. And most of my violin studies, not all, but most, was firmly in the classical tradition. And to the point that my goal, as I entered my undergraduate studies at Stony Brook University, was to become a violinist. I thought that was going to be my career. And I realized that I liked the violin, but I loved the saxophone. And you have to do what you love, especially if you're going to be a musician. We know it's not an easy field. You may as well do what you love. So I still play violin sometimes, but only for recreation. And I had never played classical saxophone. All of my teachers were calling classical saxophone legit saxophone in kind of a pejorative manner. And it seems that the classical and jazz worlds, not only with saxophone, but with many other instruments that have traditions far longer than the saxophone, speak about jazz and classical as completely different worlds. And all you need to do is to look at any major conservatory, not just in the United States, where we have the first university-level jazz program, which was actually at the Frost School of Music, University of Miami, but anywhere in the world, and you have a music department and a jazz department. Now, the wording of that says something. I think it says something, right? I really think it says something. So there is something that is maybe not explicitly, but implicitly said about these different styles of music, that they seem to exist with some glass wall between them. But I don't think that it has to be that way, especially the fact that all of you are professionals who know how to play your various instruments or voice types with great skill, that there's no reason why you can't access multiple styles if you choose to. I think it has great benefits artistically. It certainly has benefits professionally. And I feel that I'm a testament to that, because I've embraced my multiple style background, and I love playing jazz, I love playing classical. I'm actually learning a lot more about the pop side of saxophone now, which is a very new thing for me, but I think it's very valid as well. And I think no matter what your discipline, you can learn a great deal from simply keeping an open mind. But what I'm attempting to do today is to show you some of the ways in which I've tackled this. I've had to look retrospectively. I find, especially with jazz studies or any popular music, oftentimes we don't teach it the way we learned it. especially with jazz and popular music, we often learn through experience, attending jam sessions, listening to recordings, transcriptions, whereas classical music is almost decidedly a formalized study where we look at the page, we have a master telling us, as if it's master to apprentice, this is how you should do this. I think there's many ways of learning. So, of course, there must be other ways to do this, but I would like to show you the way that I think is effective, and I hope it's useful to you. So what I'd like to do now is I have one short jazz selection as well. I feel like, who's this guy coming and telling you guys, here, I'm going to show you something. So I feel like let me at least show you that I attempt to be able to do this, and hopefully you enjoy it, and then I can speak about how I've achieved this so far. Okay, so I'd like to welcome some fine musicians up to perform with me, and I will change my mouthpiece. Yeah, so 3 choruses total, right? Thank you.
Nice.
Instrumentalists always need praise. Always need praise because we're very self-deprecating. It helps. Thank you. We're the most insecure people in the world, musicians. We need it. You guys are great. Fantastic. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to catch my breath for a second then. Okay. Okay. All right. All right, so just gonna sit here instead. So I think one of the most important things to remember, if you already have experience in multiple styles, or if you've been considering it, that the skill set that you already have is extremely important. It's not necessary to try to reinvent the concept of technique on your instrument, or good quality tone. As an example, for myself, I spend a good, maybe I'd say at least 40% of my practicing time is on nothing but tone. Tone, 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 tone. If you sound good, if you have a good solid sound that you can shape, then that enables you to search for what you need to do physically to achieve the right sound for the style you're playing. Of course, this is something that is more directly related to the winds, but even with percussion, using the right tools for the job, there's no substitute for it. And if you keep in mind that there is something that you would be physically doing to achieve whatever sound quality you want, then sometimes it really just comes down to searching in the practice room for what do I physically do to produce that. I try to come at things from a very practical standpoint. There's a great deal of emotional language that's attached to music and music education particularly, and it's inspiring sometimes, but it's not always helpful. I've gone to many master classes with some brilliant teachers, and I feel like I learned something just by being around them, but it's not necessarily the advice that they gave that was all that helpful if everything is this very expressive language. It doesn't really get to the heart of, well, what do I actually do now? Now I understand the concept. What do I do day to day to make this happen? I can speak from experience on the saxophone. Something that I do all the time are overtone exercises. The saxophone is really nothing more than a mechanical trumpet. It plays it easier. The key work forces a particular note to come out, but that doesn't mean that that note's going to sound the way you want it to. So many of you may be already familiar with overtones. If you play a wind instrument, then you work with overtones all the time. If you're a brass player, then of course, that's how you isolate your partials. But on the saxophone, if you have experience with it, but maybe not have explored it that much, the idea of using a fingering for one of the lower notes, in this case low B flat, the lowest note, and using only my throat and tongue muscles to isolate the next partial. It's all about finding, again, what you can physically do to produce the sound that you want. I think it's very useful, especially for wind players. It's very important to have technique that's extremely solid. The kinds of scale studies that you might use, the etudes. If you are a classical player and you want to break into jazz or vice versa, technique is technique. Knowing the instrument in and out, regardless of the genre that you're playing, is paramount. So if you find there's a particular key in which you don't feel all that comfortable, well, that's the key that you should practice. If you find that you're playing in the key of D and you're very happy with that, stop practicing the key of D. You don't need it. You may not need it. Right? It's very easy to get into a practice room and not actually practice, but to be really playing for your own artistic gratification. And to find the difference between those two can be difficult because it's hard to take the baggage that is your own ego and leave it outside of the door and look at your own playing from a third-person perspective and say, okay, I really have to get down to work. And I find that if I have a practice session that's really intense, it may be a shorter session. It may be 1 hour instead of 3, but I feel like I got more out of that session if I was really listening and really correcting than to fall back on something that makes me feel better about myself because I can play it well. So usually if I find that I'm playing something well, I leave it aside. I say, okay, maybe I'll leave a few minutes. I'll have my musical candy at the end of the practice session, but I need to play things that don't sound good right now. Things that I know if I played in front of a crowd, I would not be very happy with the result. That's what you should practice. But that's regardless of the style. And I doubt that there's any way that I'm telling you new information. And that's the point. None of this is new information. This is all the same way that you would practice toward any musical goal. And I think that's the most important thing to remember. When you start to get into the specifics of whatever style you're learning, of course, it's very possible to find a jazz or commercial musician who wants to learn classical skills, but I usually find, just from my experience, that it's more so from those who come from formal classical training who have not embarked on commercial or jazz music. But whichever style you're coming from, to understand not just the differences between those musical paradigms, but also the similarities between them, I think help to make, for example, practicing a lot easier. If you consider how we learn language, the first day of a foreign language class, you're going to learn a few set phrases. Hi, how are you? Where's the library? Things like that. You're not going to start out with, okay, here is the subject-object-verb form of basic Japanese sentences, and we're going to study grammar. You don't do that the first day because it's unmanageable, and you don't have the background to understand the context. But if you can learn those set phrases, well, now you're speaking. And it's not just practical, but it's a motivator for you to want to do more. This is important in music as well, especially if you're a teacher. If you can get your students to have tangible results quickly, they're going to want to practice more. For any of you who teach, especially young children, it's very difficult to get them to want to practice more. But as we move through our professional lives, we forget that we still will act like children in the practice room. And we still will find ways to avoid what we really want to practice. So especially with versatility, if I'm speaking from the example of a classical musician who wants to learn jazz, learning some idiomatic phrases, learning set phrases that you may not understand the theoretical breakdown of how that phrase works, but something simple. It's a blues riff. I started out, my first jazz riff, I was, I don't know how I remember this, but my first jazz riff, I was in 8th grade. So it's basically moving up a minor scale, right, between the tonic and the dominant. And then it goes back to the median back down to the tonic. And my instructions were to learn that and then learn that in 12 keys, which is a very common trope in jazz, to learn an idea and then learn it in all the keys. I submit to you that instead of first learning it in 12 keys, immediately learn it in the keys you're actually going to use. If you're going to be playing a song in the key of concert B flat or concert F or concert D, learn those 3 keys first. And of course, you want to add the others. You want complete versatility. But we also want to do this from a practical standpoint, you know. So eventually, yes, you want and be able to play that up and down. But learning these little set phrases are very, very helpful. I needed to do this from transcriptions. There weren't many transcription books available, save for the one that all saxophonists, I'm sure, have encountered, the Charlie Parker Omni book, which is the kind of like the Arbonne of saxophone jazz study. But today there are transcription books, very good ones, that have been produced for almost any artist you can think of. And especially if you come from the classical tradition, you now have it on the page. You have this available in the same way as if you were learning a classical solo. Right? The difficulty becomes the style. So I'm just going to outline a few things about what makes the stylistic traits of these different, of classical and jazz quite different from each other. It's still the same technique. If you're working with tonguing, well, tonguing is tonguing. If you're working with good airflow, it's the same thing. But in classical music, there tends to be a very narrow definition of what is an acceptable tone quality. Of course, there's variations. If you listen to Eugene Rousseau, and you listen to Marcel Mule, and you listen to Tim McAllister, you're going to hear very, very different sounds. Sometimes because they're a product of their time period. There is a different aesthetic. But they were all playing the same instrument. But within that, there's still a pretty narrow definition of how to produce a good tone. And for all of you who are especially wind players, a lot of this comes down to using the right equipment. This is a jazz mouthpiece, very much a jazz mouthpiece. It's very loud, tends to be on the brighter side. And this would not be very suitable for classical music. I can do my best to try to make it sound that way, but it's really not going to be convincing. Somewhat, but it still has this brightness to it, this edginess that I'll never really be able to get rid of. Now, if I show you my classical mouthpiece, just simple things that you can do that will already make you sound very convincing in whatever style you're playing, especially for those instruments that use mouthpieces. Although I know some flutists who play jazz and classical music, and they have different head joints. They choose to use head joints of different materials. I often find that if someone likes a darker sound and they use, let's say, a gold head joint for classical, they may choose to use that silver head joint for jazz because it's a bit brighter and it actually picks up on the microphone easier, especially with flute being so terribly difficult to microphone these days. But if I change mouthpieces, you're going to hear an immediate change in my sound because it's constructed for a different purpose. And it does that purpose well, but it really only does that purpose. The concept of having one mouthpiece to fit all of your needs, it's really a misnomer. It's not really true. And I don't think that's true for really any instrument. You may be able to effectively play. That's you being effective. But if you want to sound very effective in the style, a lot of this is about tone quality. And there's only so much that you can do to affect your tone quality, no matter how good you are. If I'm playing on this, I'm never going to have that dark. I'm never going to have quite that sound, and it makes it very convincing. As we learn style versatility, the goal is not necessarily to be a complete expert in all styles unless that's what you want. But you want to sound effective. You want to sound convincing in that style. And that's one of the most important aspects. So that's why it's important to listen to recordings of people who you consider to be masters in those styles. And it may seem like a very old way of doing things, but playing a bit of copycat on recordings really does help. And I still do it. I tend to do it less now because when I need to interpret a piece, for example, I'll be playing the Ibert saxophone concerto pretty soon, in about 2.5 weeks. I don't really want to listen to too many other people playing that because I'll find myself copying them on stage. And that's not where I want to be at this point in my playing. But especially if you're new to that style, let's say you haven't played too much classical saxophone or you haven't played too much classical trumpet, and maybe you want to listen to, Fred Mills' interpretation of Virgen de la Macarena or something like that, because it'll help you play the piece better. And so the real goal is not simply to understand the technique of, let's say, how to play the notes for a jazz piece versus a classical piece, but how can I play it so that someone will not necessarily know that I play another style when I play it. And I think that the best example of that would be what we find with very high-level Broadway musicians. So over the years, there have been more and more instruments added to a particular woodwind seat in Broadway shows. A lot of that is because of changes in the way that musicians are actually paid. Prior to the 1970s, they were paid per instrument, and now they're paid per seat. So it's very, very different. I saw a reworking of West Side Story that had 9 instruments on the reed tube book. 9. And they included bassoon. And one of my former teachers was lucky that he was probably the only saxophonist in New York that knew how to scrape his own oboe crows. And he played an oboe part on the first reed book. And I asked him, "Are you an oboist?" And he said, "No, I could never hold my own with oboe players, but I took some lessons with one of the oboists from the Met, and they were $200 a pop, and they were the best $400 I ever spent on oboe, because he taught me what I needed to know. How do I sound convincing so that when you look at me, you hear my sound, you say, okay, that's an oboe player. But then 5 minutes later, he needs a flute in his hands, and he has to sound like a flute player. Is he going to be able to compete with Ron Paul? Of course not. He's not going to be that. But that's the virtuosity of versatility is seen very much in that kind of setting. And I think we can learn a great deal from musicians of that type. They're not trying to be complete experts in everything they do, but it's about getting that job done to the best of your ability so you sound convincing. So for example, even if you, let's say you only have a classical mouthpiece and you're trying to work with some jazz. If I take something like a blues scale, or maybe even not a blues scale, I'll just take a major scale. Here's a concert B-flat scale. I find in jazz one of the easiest and at the same time most difficult things to do is to swing, because we have so many sources that tell us how we're supposed to swing. I often see dotted 8th note 16th. Thankfully, I don't see it too much anymore. It was in a couple of those old Lenny Niehaus books. Thankfully, we don't see it too much anymore. Swing rhythm is a testament to the fact that there are limitations of the Western notation system, because all of it is derivative of basically a log of 2. Everything has to do with half of something or double of something else. And anything that exists in between that is not going to work that well. So technically, you can't really notate it, but we often use triplets. If you imagine an 8th note triplet, and you tie the first 2 of those 8th notes together, that's still not really swing, because now what you need to do is you have to add the proper accenting. And that's the part that people often miss. If you add the accenting, now it starts to sound like jazz. Now, from the perspective of a wind player, it should not be added with your tongue. It's not a tongue accent. It is a diaphragm accent. It's only from your breath. The idea is that the shorter of the 2 notes is much more accented and punches a lot more than the first longer note. Swing was described by Wynton Marsalis as the feeling that the first note slows the time down, but the second note prevents you from missing the next beat. And if you listen to groups like the Count Basie Band, or bands that really swing hard, how they achieve that is that first note, they make it even longer, as long as they possibly can, and they really procrastinate to get to that second note. So at slower tempos, is a lot more convincing than, right? So it's all about, in that case, the articulation helps you to produce the attitude. Now, if I worked on finding that attitude of the swing, even if the pieces I'm playing are decidedly simplistic, I'm going to sound like I fit in that setting. And I'm going to be a much more effective musician in that musical environment. In the same way, if you're used to playing, let's say, jazz and commercial music, and you have an opportunity for a classical setting, classical music tends to have these very smooth notes where the beginning, the middle, and the end of the note are all supposed to have the exact same tonal quality. That's a little bit difficult for someone who, let's say, if you're playing jazz and you're used to waving the end of your notes with a bit of vibrato all the time, Right? Especially if you play a lot of the, I know there are at least several of you here who are pretty well versed in what we call trad jazz, more of that, that kind of old marching style. But then if you were to take that and move to classical music, your vibrato needs to encompass the beginning, middle, and end of the note. The entire note has to have vibrato so that it doesn't sound like it's added on top of it. It has to sound like it's part of the note. That's the difference between vibrato in jazz and vibrato in classical. So, versus. So even if I play a classical style vibrato, but I start the vibrato maybe halfway through the note, it's going to sound a little bit off from what the style should be. So if I have a long note, I can't just start the vibrato, right? But that's something that you will hear if you listen to several examples of classical saxophone, or if you listen to classical flute versus jazz flute, you'll hear those differences in those recordings. And we're not, again, trying to necessarily become complete experts in that style unless that is your goal, to do so. It became mine because I was enthralled with the different opportunities I was afforded. And I very much enjoy those different musical settings. But if you're looking for effectiveness, it's about sounding as effective in the style as possible so that no one will question your ability to play that style to the point where they may not even know that you play any other styles. And that's really how to make the gig work as well as possible. I don't know if anyone has any questions so far. If there's anything in particular, even if I didn't address the issue, if any of you have experiences with different styles of music and you've either encountered difficulty or you want my opinion on something at any point. Yeah.
So you mentioned swing style, how it's not strictly the length of the notes, or the duration of the notes, I should say, that determines swing, but it's also the inflection or articulation.
Yes.
Is there a tempo at which it becomes exclusively the inflection of the note that creates a swing style? Like in a faster tempo, the notes are actually the same duration of time, but the inflection is primarily what's creating the feel.
Well, certainly the faster the tempo, the more difficult it will be to show the accented difference between the long note and the short note, simply because there's just not enough time. So for example, we hear this a lot in bebop-related music. I feel that the influence of the bebop style is such that you really can't go wrong with studying even a small amount of bebop, because so much of modern jazz is entirely based on bebop-style phrasing and bebop-style swing that you really can't escape it. Most of what we hear today is there's all these different names: post-bop, modern, contemporary. It's really all bebop-derived music, which originally was released to the world in 1947. It was recorded in 1945. Charlie Parker's first album was released in 1947. Only a single, actually. But in bebop styles, you really can't hear too much of that difference. So it seems that if you go past a certain speed, just for the sake of keeping the line smooth, you're now forced to forego some of that breath accent, because if you don't, it now slows down the time. So if I tried to accent, again, just with my air, with diaphragm motion, just the offbeats at a tempo like that, it may end up sounding a bit silly, or I may not even be able to maintain the tempo. It doesn't really work too well. But at slower tempos, the slower you go, the harder you have to swing to keep it convincing. But as far as tonguing goes, if you listen to 5 recordings of a very fast eighth note swing run, you'll hear 5 different styles of articulating it. And there's really no rule for it. There's a loose guideline, I'd say, that what we tend to do is we take, if we represent swing normally with just 2 eighth notes, right? They're represented as eighth notes that on the page, they look the same length, but we know that the first, the downbeat eighth note, is played far longer than the second. that the shorter second eighth note will be tied to the next downbeat, so that we're actually slurring 2 notes at a time. So if I were to start that same scale, they're all eighth notes, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up. The first down I would tongue, and the first up I would tongue. I'm actually tonguing both of those the first 2 notes, but from the second note on, I'm slurring 2 at a time. The idea is that by tonguing the shorter note, it helps us to accent it easier. So I'm tonguing on that shorter note, but you don't have to. If you listen to Sonny Rollins, for example, he tongues every note. He's not slurring anything. Right. He doesn't bother to slur anything. So it really still comes down to this concept of airflow, which is equally important in classical music as well as jazz. So it seems like a much longer answer than you probably needed, but I hope it, I hope it was helpful. Yes.
Do you see a difference with like New Orleans swing versus like Chicago and the different time periods from early jazz, like the 20s to now? Well, not now, but say the 70s, 60s.
I think it's such an interesting question because Chicago jazz, in its, I guess what we would call mature form, was actually New Orleans jazz because it didn't develop in Chicago. Most of those groups actually developed in New Orleans, and they were part of the New Orleans diaspora, or the Great Migration, depending on, what you want to call it. But as an example, the first group that recorded jazz ever was a group that historically drew a lot of ire because they were an all-white group. But people didn't realize that all of them were from New Orleans. And most of the musicians they performed with were African American. They were from the city that jazz was birthed, but they performed in Chicago. They were called the Original Dixieland Jazz Band. And everybody claimed that they invented jazz at that point. So you'll find everyone says, the progenitors of jazz, and Jelly Roll Morton actually had business cards that said inventor of jazz and jaunty music. So if you look at New Orleans and Chicago style, you're going to find very similar styles where you can hear a great deal of the military music, especially the post-Civil War military music. A lot of it was American-made, but Irish and English influenced. So we were really just on the cusp in the late 1800s of defining really what American concert band music was. It really was still mostly for military purposes, but we were still very much influenced by broadsides, which were taking old hymns and converting them to American music. Like, for example, our national anthem was originally called the Anacreontic Hymn. It was actually, technically it was a drinking song, a very fun drinking song. But this was an entirely wholly American thing to do, is if people didn't understand how to read music, well, use a song they already know. But as far as how swing evolved, if you look at New Orleans versus Chicago jazz, they're going to sound virtually the same up until the point where the Harlem Renaissance starts to affect Chicago jazz. So, for example, Louis Armstrong did not move to Chicago until he was asked by his former mentor, Nathan Oliver, King Oliver. He actually had no intention of leaving because he thought that jazz would not survive outside of New Orleans. Most people had no clue what jazz was. And he was playing, this... So there was none of that. We don't have the bebop chromaticism that was added in the 1940s, these extra, and certainly none of the, what we call substituted chords. We didn't do too much of that. Although you'll find Louis Armstrong did. That's one of the reasons why he was so awesome. He was like 30 years ahead of his time. But once you start to hear big band music in the Harlem Renaissance toward the end of the 1920s, then we start to hear a bit closer to what we would consider that modern jazz sound to be. But it depends on the band leader. Because Duke Ellington certainly was ahead of his time. It was maybe 5 years after he started playing at the Cotton Club, he decided to turn his band into more of an art ensemble. But Fletcher Henderson was always about dance music. So he really didn't move out of that vein. It depends on the instrumentalist. But from bebop on, it seemed to open the floodgates to this incredibly fast music where swing would never really feel the same. And to the point where now, if you insert Chicago or New Orleans styles, it's seen as decidedly old. But it wasn't really until the 1940s that that became seen as traditional. People didn't use the term trad or traditional until bebop came on the scene. You know? So now if you play, I think it was part of Sidney Bechet's solo from High Society that I played before. Right? Some players never stopped doing that. He played well into the 1960s when you had the birth of free jazz. Ornette Coleman was playing in the 1960s. That was when he met Charlie Hayden, and they were playing this very, very avant-garde music that sounded nothing like the jazz that most people listen to today, but he was still playing that. So it overlaps, you know. But it's good to know which style of jazz you're working with, so that if you're trying to learn trad jazz, you might find that there's less legato in the music. There was a lot of the march feel was still there, and you hear how I articulate. But then if I'm playing more of a bebop style, as legato as can possibly be, you know? But it's really only a slight change of articulation that makes that convincing. And you may not consider it until you're in the practice room listening and say, how can I sound like Bechet? What is he doing? Well, his vibrato is a lot wider, right? He kind of lets it go. Right? So you're going to let your jaw fly loose. But bebop, you're not going to find too much at all. So it's a lot of it's just comparing those styles. I think the same kind of comparison you would do between a classical sonata and a short jazz solo. You know, it's finding what do I physically do to allow me to sound that way. Because there's always an answer that I think is a simple one. I think there's always an answer that is not simply, well, I'm feeling the music, man, because that doesn't help anyone. Although I always had answers like that given to me in lessons and in workshops, but I always felt there has to be some simple thing that I can do, something that I can physically do to make it easier to play. You know. Oh, yes.
I'm curious, some of the more interesting stories of, you know, to me, being more interested in the jazz world, hearing a lot more kind of movement into going out and grabbing some, you know, different techniques or whatever it is, or moving more towards like an art concept for, that seems, I'm just curious about some of the more interesting stories you may have seen, like seeing a group like that come together and like where people are coming from and artistically when they're doing something like that.
Do you mean this as far as like stylistic diversity within one group, or?
Yeah, I guess I hear a lot of, you know, people kind of moving towards more kind of classical forms, or maybe grabbing some classical techniques as well, even within jazz. So I'm just curious what.
Well, you know, I think that's a testament to the positive side of the institutionalization of jazz. Because for many years it was a music you learned by rote. There were no jazz collegiate programs before early 1970s. And before that, the way that you learned jazz was you went to jam sessions, you found someone you basically, I guess you would call yourself a journeyman jazz musician, right? But today you can study it just like classical music. And there's etude books, and there's scale books, and there's all these things. And I don't mean to say that in a pejorative way. I think there's a double-edged sword when you take any kind of music and you put it in the institution, because now you're telling people this is how it should be played. But before you get to the point artistically where you can decide that for yourself, it's nice to have a little bit of direction. So I think that part of it is a generational thing. If you listen to, let's say, a recording of the Village Vanguard Orchestra from, let's say, 1970, none of those players learned in the institution because it didn't exist for jazz. They learned from the school of being in New York City and playing in nightclubs and working under people and bringing out a tune and falling flat on their faces one night and deciding they want to learn it better. But if you listen to, let's say, the Wynton Marsalis's group at Lincoln Center today, fantastic group. But many of those players are quite young, and he makes a point of hiring young players. He wants it to sound like a younger generation. Many of those players did not learn that way. They learned in the institution. They have formal degrees in jazz studies, something that did not exist 2 generations ago. So I think a lot of that diversity is happening simply because the players themselves are coming from backgrounds where they were surrounded by everything. They were surrounded by formal training, and they're a product of it. People have different opinions on whether that's a good or a bad thing. I personally think it's great to find that kind of diversity in a group. I just performed with a group. I was in Thailand in June, and a saxophonist I play with, if you haven't checked him out, I really think you should. His name, he goes under the stage name Mr. Saxman, and he is an amazing musician. And he's known for jazz, but man, he can break out classical music like that, and he sounds amazing. And it's informed the way that he plays. I find, especially when I go out of the United States, I find more of a mixing of genres in such interesting ways. It's very different iterations of jazz. But I think that's where it comes from. It comes from this mixture of the institutionalization of the music. And many of us are a product of it. So, I don't know if there are any other questions or... Yes?
One of the things we battle with, is like sometimes we rehearse all morning, we rehearse all afternoon in various groups, and then we still need to find some time to practice, but our chops are gone.
Oh, yeah.
So how do you prioritize? What have you found most effective? I know you probably dealt with the same thing where one day you'll have 30 minutes to be able to play, and some days you'll have 3 or 4 hours. How do you prioritize and schedule your thought processes for practice sessions?
I find that problem more and more, especially as I have more professional obligations at the university. And it can be very tough because you may have that half hour in the practice room. I found it very helpful to regiment my practice schedule where I include it on my calendar in the same way that anything else is included. And then when I see throughout the week how much total time I actually have, I may have I only have 3 or 3.5 hours this week of total time while I will be in that room. And I try to plan out what I'll do before I get there. I think that's the first step, is to plan your practicing for the week the same way that the rest of your life is planned. And it's traditionally not done by too many people because we get into the practice room and say, okay, time to warm up. So even something like a warm-up. What is the purpose of a warm-up? What should a warm-up do? Some people may warm up for an hour, others may warm up for 10 minutes. I feel that the warm-up should be something that by the time you're done with it, helps you to complete all the other tasks in the practice room for that day. So you can target your warm-up also so that you maximize the effectiveness while not essentially wasting time by doing something that it may be great to play a half hour of long tones, but you might not have the time to do that. Maybe try 10 minutes of it and then see if when you get to work on your pieces, it still works. And I think that having that regimented attitude about it is part of it. The other part is prioritizing what needs to be learned when. If you know that you have 3 weeks to learn one piece and then 5 days to learn the other one, it's not to say that you won't play the piece that you have 3 weeks at all, but you may start from 10, 15 minutes on that and ramp up the time. But you'll only figure that out if you take a look at your week and say, I have to treat practicing like I would treat anything else. I essentially have to treat practicing the way I would tell my students to, but I may find that I'm a bit hypocritical about that. Most of us tell students, you have to practice, but do we say anything else about it? You know, and many of us have teaching experience, and you may teach now. To tell someone to practice is very good, but it's only half the story. And especially if you're working with someone who doesn't have the experience of how to do it effectively, you probably should help them figure out a plan. I have my students do practice logs. And it's very simple for them to do it, but this way, and I tell them it's not for me, it's for them. You know? And if someone's lying on their practice log, well, fine, then you're not going to progress. It's something for them. But I think keeping a practice log for yourself, if you know that you're the kind of person that won't do it unless you write it down, and you know who you are, because I'm one of them, if I don't write it down, if I don't put it in my schedule as if it were a dentist appointment, then I won't do it. And I think part of it is just knowing yourself and being true to yourself, understanding what your habits are in the rest of your life, because those same habits are going to leak into the practice room, good and bad. And I think it's more of a general answer, but I find it's definitely helped me. Yeah. And of course, any style benefits from that, maximizing the time you have in the practice room. That precious, precious little time. You know. You see. I think I may have actually gotten through most of what I planned on. I don't know if there's any other questions or how many of you consider yourselves to be playing in multiple styles enough that you feel confident in more than one style already, and you do that? Is that something that you learned prior to your work with the military, or is this something that you've already been doing and you extended to your military work?
For me, it's as a result of being in the military, because prior to the military, I only had probably played some styles. So the military has given me the opportunity to play in a bunch of other styles. So just by nature of what we do, sometimes you're the drummer for a jazz combo, a rock band, a New Orleans brass band, a percussion concert band.
So then I hope these ideas are something that would be directly useful to you, especially if you're already in an environment where you may be called upon to participate in something, or maybe if you pick up another skill, then there's other things that your skills are applicable to, which is also good. I'm sorry, did you?
Oh yeah, sir. So I think learning sub-styles too has been an experience for me, because like clarinet player on paper in the Army, but I play saxophone too. And I would have said I was comfortable playing jazz, but commercial. But I've learned that brass band saxophone is a technique all in itself. Just learning how to project that kind of sound and stuff. So that's just an example. But like, yeah, I'd say being comfortable in certain styles and sub-styles too has been a challenge and an experience in itself.
You reminded me of the skill of performing in ensembles. I think really is also wrapped up in this, because if you're in a chamber group within the same style as a large ensemble, it's still a very different animal. And the way that your tone has to blend with a quartet is different than the way it has to blend with a large band. And these are things I didn't experience until I had the opportunity to. When I was in school, I was always in these very small saxophone studios. We usually didn't have too much more opportunity other than quartets. But for the past 3 years, I was playing in a concert band in New York, and it's such a different animal. I had to learn to adjust. Tuning feels very different as well. It may feel difficult at times, but the kind of advice that you received in AIT with justified tuning is very, very important, really important, especially when you consider that an instrument like the saxophone, as an example, I don't know if any of you have heard of the theory of hyperbolic tuning. Essentially, the theory is that a conical-shaped instrument, by virtue of it being a cone, is going to cause very odd intonation issues. I don't know if I necessarily buy it, but nevertheless, the saxophone is an instrument that if you tune with the tuner, then congratulations, one of your notes is in tune. And every time you play that one note, it's going to sound great. Unless it's a major third above the root, in which case it has to be 13 cents flat now, So, and the truth of the matter is, I look at those kinds of charts And I think in a cerebral way, it's very useful to see those numbers, but it's really just a guide because you also have to deal with the tendencies of your own instruments. No instrument is completely in tune. But if you listen to a group, they may be playing the simplest of pieces. And the fact that they're in tune and their fourths and fifths and their thirds sound great, that alone makes them sound so much more professional. It's not always about the difficulty of the music in terms of the finger technique, but how you execute it and how an ensemble comes together and you can hear this one-mindedness, especially in small groups. When I work with my quartet, we usually have 3-hour practice sessions, and we spend the first hour doing nothing but tuning exercises. We do simple exercises where we may take essentially a tuning drone, and we play different intervals off of it. Our philosophy is that the lowest instrument is king or queen of the intonation room, no matter what it is. So if my Barry player is 5 cents sharp, then I guess I'm in the Berlin Philharmonic for a day, and I can't do anything about it. But those kinds of decisions are things that are helpful in any style. So those skills, and I didn't see any of those materials until Erica had shown me some of the materials from when she was in AIT, and I was so happy that these are things that are important to AIT training because I didn't encounter them that much when I was in school. And you would have thought that I would have. But most musicians don't, and I think it puts you ahead of the game. But when you play jazz or when you play classical or any style in between, don't forget those things. Simple things like tuning, they're very hard to do, and it'll work in any style. There was something I included here about the difference between the idioms, and I just wanted to clarify it. I already mentioned that classical music has a relatively narrow definition of what is considered an acceptable tone, and I put that that jazz generally has a wider definition of acceptable tone quality, and I wanted to clarify that because I think a good sound is a good sound, but depending on someone's personal style, especially with an instrument like saxophone where the tone is very malleable, you find this with clarinet as well, that the tuning of the instrument can fluctuate sometimes. If you listen to someone like David Sanborn, for example, fantastic player, many styles, he made his fortune in smooth jazz, but he can hold his own on any kind of straight-ahead tune as well as anybody. And his style often includes this, he sometimes gets slightly flat, ever so slightly flat. And it's part of this more like very similar, like a Cannonball Adderley kind of style. And then if you listen to someone like one of my personal heroes, Paquito de Rivera, wonderful musician. One of the reasons I'm so drawn to him in particular is because he has formal classical training from the Havana Conservatory, which was and still is one of the best music schools in the world. It's amazing musicians have come out of that school. Arturo Sandoval, Chucho Valdez, everyone from that generation. He plays jazz, he plays classical, and his tone is very, very different. He plays spot on. His tuning is always spot on. Very, very different style, but he's going for a different feel. And I think that depending on the style of jazz you're playing in particular, there's leeway in the tuning, in the fluctuation of the tone. And the only way I learned this was just by experimenting. I never had anyone sitting next to me saying, okay, now we're going to do this with your jaw, now we're going to do this, and then you're going to sound like Paquito. And the truth of the matter is that you'll never sound exactly like any player that you like. You're always going to sound like you, and that's a good thing. But to listen to a recording and play copycat, like I said, that very, very old style of doing things, it really does work. It's sometimes the only way that you can mimic a style. You may understand the tuning and the accenting and the articulation and all of the fingerings, and the rest of the puzzle is really to listen to the style and any of those secondary characteristics that you can't place or you can't put on the page are things that are, again, a testament to the limitations of Western notation and the fact that jazz is still, in part, an oral tradition. We never really completely left it. But for that matter, classical music has some of those attributes as well. Or, the great tradition of marching band music and concert band music. There's something that you can only get by listening to and being around other musicians. And don't write that off as something that won't be helpful to you. So, yes?
Are there any things you've taken from, maybe a jazz style of rehearsal techniques that have helped you in the classical world or vice versa? Or?
Definitely. Actually, in a very tangible way, I guess I'll mention one instrument technique and one practice technique. The instrument technique is my how I form my embouchure, my mouth position for saxophone. As with any reed instrument, when you're playing, it's really, if you imagine this, like the scales of justice, right? In the front and in the back, you have either work that you're going to do with your lip and your mouth muscles, or work that you're going to do with your throat and your tongue in order to affect the tone. And those are the only two things that are going to affect the tone. And you just have to decide how much of the front or the back or both you want to include in that. And I've found that my jazz playing, because of the mouthpieces I use, has forced me to loosen my embouchure from what my formal training from classical music has told me to do. Most classical saxophonists and classical reed players, clarinet included, often have fairly tight embouchures. They're biting a lot more, and it causes them to use harder reeds. But I've loosened up my embouchure so that I can get this broader sound in jazz, and I've experimented with that in classical music. And what I found was altissimo became a breeze. When I started to really use my, what we call voicing, which is something that's used in all the woodwinds, and to a certain extent even for brass players, of course. It's what you're doing with the throat is something that is not often discussed, but for every wind instrument is very vital. So I used to bite quite a lot. And the reason that doesn't work too well with the setup is I use a much softer reed now. I use a pretty soft reed, but what I do instead is I keep my mouth position steady, and instead I'm using the throat muscles and I'm tightening in the back for my altissimo notes. Which gives me greater control. I can add vibrato if I want to when I previously couldn't. But that's not something that I got from the jazz side of things. I got that from, I'm sorry, it's not something I learned from the classical tradition. I learned it from the jazz tradition, and I use it on my classical setup because it was just easier. As far as at practicing techniques or rehearsal techniques, I found that by improvising, it opens you up to unexpected situations. And in general, any kind of music is going to have unexpected situations, be it a mistake that's made by you or someone else, or some other unexpected thing that may happen in the music, or even an opportunity to add extra notes. Those of you who have experience in the Baroque tradition, that's a tradition that you have opportunity to add quite a lot of material other than those on the page. But by improvising, I think it primes you to be able to roll with the unexpected a bit more. Even just a small bit of improvisation experience. It's a good exercise to do. It's something that is very freeing, I think. And it's something that I incorporate in my teaching. Whether I have a classical studio or a jazz studio, we engage in group free jazz exercises. I call it free jazz exercises. It's really just collective improvisation. It's an interesting thing to do when you have absolutely no directions given to you, and you can play anything you want, and the only direction is to listen to the musicians around you to try to make it sound as good as possible. It makes you think in a very different way, because usually we have everything is on the page. The composer's vision is what guides us and what restricts us. But having some experience just improvising, even if your gig is classical music. That's fine. It will help you to think differently in those unexpected situations. And something that may have seemed like an insurmountable change or mistake or something may not really seem all that damning to a performance, especially if you've been used to it. And I think that's what playing jazz has done for my classical playing. Really just the mindset of the improviser. So, I think that's it for me. If you have any other questions, and please, by all means. I also provided my contact information. If you want to contact me for any reason, then you're more than welcome to. I hope that this was useful to you. I hope that you enjoyed it as well. And it was my absolute pleasure to perform here and to talk here today. And thank you very much for your service. I think it's wonderful that you're all serving your country, and you're also doing that through your personal passion. And I think to be able to combine those two is something that not many people in the world can do. So thank you.